Hello, and welcome to Jesuitical. You're about to hear a great conversation with Cardinal Michael Czerny. Before we begin, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and for more great content from America, visit americamagazine.org. Joining us in studio is Cardinal Michael Czerny, the prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development and the co-author of a new book, Siblings All, Sign of the Times. Welcome to Jesuitical, Your Eminence.
Thank you.
And sitting in for Ashley McKinless is Sebastian Gomes, who, like his eminence, hails from the land up north.
That's the real reason why I'm here.
Yes, we wanted to make sure you felt at home, and so we brought a Canadian on to be with you.
I always tell my colleagues here at American Media that we're also a mission of the Jesuits in Canada as well. So we got to cover that church as well.
Don't forget it.
So we're going to spend a little bit of time just getting to know you and your ministry, and then we're going to pivot to some of the really big questions that your book comes up with that are facing the church and the world today. Before we get there, you are both a Jesuit and a cardinal, which some would find a bit of an odd pairing, I suppose. No more odd than a Jesuit pope, I suppose. But I remember when you were named a cardinal, one of the interesting things was you weren't yet an archbishop. And so I believe you were officially an archbishop for like a day. Is that correct? One day. Could you tell that story a little bit, or why it had to be that way?
Well, no, there's no big reason. It's just that about 10 days or 2 weeks before I was going to become a cardinal, the Pope told me that I had to become a bishop first and mentioned and by the way, I'm ordaining on the 4th if you want to come along.
If you want to stop by.
So I said, sure, I don't have a better offer. So on Friday, the 4th of October, the feast of St. Francis of Assisi, I was ordained archbishop of a plot of desert somewhere in Tunisia. The name is Beneventum. And our claim to fame is that we were a suffragan of Archbishop Augustine of Hippo.
Oh, no kidding.
So that was a great honor. Otherwise, I don't know anything about my diocese, which the next day became my former diocese. And so that's all I can tell you about being an archbishop.
Well, Pope Francis has appointed you a cardinal, obviously, but you're also involved in a number of very important missions of the church that are headquartered in Rome. You're on a bunch of different dicasteries. You're traveling a lot. You're writing books that are interpreting the Pope's, teachings, magisterial teachings for the church and for the world, which means, I presume, that you're a pretty close collaborator of Pope Francis. So my first question is just how's he doing?
Fine. He's doing fine, and I would say that the more good news he hears about the synod, the finer he is.
And what's he like to work with? What's your working relationship with him?
Simply put, he's very good to work with. He's very trusting. And when he asks you to do something, he expects you to do it without coming back and asking about each step or, in fact, any of the steps. So I think it's one of the carries over from Jesuit life. I think we have that style or tradition that when you get a mission or are asked to do something, what's included is planning it and carrying it out, not just executing.
Now, you've been in Rome for much longer than Pope Francis has. So he's now Pope for 10 years, right? But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you date back to like maybe in the early 90s when you first started. You first came to Rome to work for the Curia.
That's right.
And then you've been working in different offices in the Vatican. So
23 years all told.
Wow.
Yeah.
So a lot has changed in that time, I can imagine. And I'm especially
Including
I'm especially thinking of, when Francis was elected, he was given a mandate to reform the Vatican bureaucracy, right? The offices of the Vatican that are the governing offices for the Universal Church. And here we are 10 years later, we have a new constitution, the new governing documents for that bureaucracy. So in that time that you've been in Rome, what's the biggest change from the time that you started in the 90s or the early 2000s even to 23 years later?
Well, I suppose my response is very subjective. I began in Rome working with the Jesuits. We honestly, at least in my area of the social apostolate, we had very little contact with the Vatican. We were entirely oriented towards the society and its works all over the world. So I would say that during my first stint in Rome, the first 11 years, it was mostly an unknown. I, of course, caught a glimpse of one Holy Father or the other, but it wasn't, I guess I couldn't call it a working relationship. Then when I came back in 2010 to work with Cardinal Peter Turkson, of course that changed, but even there, sort of given the givens, I had more to do, much more to do with what he needed and what he was about than the relationship with the Vatican itself. Maybe because the other superiors with him, the secretary and the undersecretary, were both Italian. So I think that they, let's say, managed or maintained the relationships according to their best lights. But
is siloed maybe a good word? Like people were kind of in their own worlds, managing their own things?
No, I mean, there is, of course, there's siloing, but no, it's not a question of siloing. It's more, I think, maybe it's fairly typical of government that each department is, to a certain extent, its own
culture. And...
culture, its own realm. And if there's coordination, that's higher up. It's not us. It wasn't up to us to coordinate. Maybe we could put it that way. And so, as you mentioned, Pope Francis came in with I would say practically an overwhelming mandate to reform, and that reform has now taken various forms and taken various stages.
What didn't people like? Why were they asking him to reform it? Because it seems like it was pretty universal. People were like, "This is broken. We have to fix it."
Yes, well, so then everything that you can think of is probably true. In other words, it's, I mean, no catalog of, let's say, reformables was ever made. So I don't, much less agreed upon by everyone. But to put it a bit simply, I would say, on the one hand, the bishops wanted to be treated differently.
The resident bishops, the bishops who are coming from around the world, or the bishops who are working...
Bishops like Archbishop Bergoglio of Buenos Aires,
right,
wanted to be treated differently when he came. So that's one huge thing, and that's very strongly reflected in Predicate Evangelium.
And we've heard that from all the bishops who are going to Rome. So when they go and they meet with the different dicasteries, like with your office or with the Holy Father himself, everybody comments about how it just feels much more conversational, much more open. It's dialogical. There's a two-way communication there.
It's quite amazing considering how brief a time we've had since the Reform began. It's amazing that they experience so much change so quickly. That's not typically what people say of us, you know.
I've always wanted to ask someone who works at the Vatican this question, and so I hope you'll forgive me a little bit, but is someone whose job it is to kind of try to make, we'll call it Vatican speak, sort of intelligible to young adult Catholics, lay Catholics, non-Catholics
too, like
even,
on the bubble.
There are some words that I find myself kind of stumbling over trying to explain to people, even just like dicastery or integral human development or the Latin titles of documents. Do you think that these kinds of words resonate with a modern audience, or if they're even relevant, should I be trying to translate them, or should I?
Well, I would say yes. As an American Catholic, you should be translating it into American, and that's more your job than ours because you're here. You know the language, you know people's questions, so translate. And if you don't know how to translate, ask.
All right.
But I would put it in that sense. I would put this very squarely on your shoulders, not on ours.
We have a mandate now from the Cardinal.
No, I like that. No, big responsibility, but I'll take it.
So work your way back then, and you say, okay, so I'm responsible for expressing what the Holy Father and the Vatican say in American. What should be the original language, presuming that we don't speak them all? And the answer is, well, it doesn't really matter. Whatever it is, it's going to be that language, and it's going to have its characteristics, and it's not going to be American. So no matter what we speak, no matter how we write, no matter what vocabulary we use, you've got a translation problem, which is not just linguistic but also cultural.
I think that's true.
I know it's true.
Really quickly, and then we're going to move to the book. I think all bishops have pectoral crosses, across that you wear around. Yours is kind of striking. It's very different than ones that I've seen. It's wood. It's not gold or silver or any kind of metal. Can you just tell the story behind it?
Well, the story is that a good friend from Chicago came to Rome to help me with becoming an archbishop and a cardinal. But before that, he spent a couple of days in Sicily, and he met somebody and said to the fellow who happened to be an artist that he needed to go to a religious goods store to buy a cross for somebody, some friend of his who was going to become a bishop. And I guess he told the artist something about me, and the artist said, "I'm not taking you to a shop, I'm taking you to my studio, I'm making the cross."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so the artist who is very dedicated to the vocation of Sicily, his slogan is, "Sicily which doesn't welcome is no longer Sicily."
And Sicily being like on the southern part of Italy, right on the Mediterranean Sea.
Beyond the southern part.
Beyond the southern part, that's true. Yeah, that's right.
So his passion and or the Holy Father's concern for migrants and refugees coincided. And so this is a contemporary cross, and it represents the tragedy of the Mediterranean and the tragedy really of all people who are forced to flee. And we have little doubt that Christ would identify with them very strongly, very directly. And what most catches people's eye is the nail. And
Yeah.
it's a bit odd because I think there's nails in every cross, but we don't see them anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah. Shifting to the book, Siblings All, Sign of the Times. This was super relevant for us because on this podcast, one of the things we do every week is we have a segment that we call Signs of the Times, where we're trying to sift through Catholic news of the week and talk about it. So I'm wondering if you could just give us a little quick history of where that phrase comes from. We know we were obviously conscious of it when we chose it, but I certainly learned some things from the book.
Our guess is that Sign of the Times is the single most impactful expression that comes out of the Council. I don't think that there's any other expression that is so quoted.
The Second Vatican Council, 1962 to 1965, that brought the world's bishops together and set the Church on a new trajectory to serve the modern world.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that because I lived through it, so I didn't think I had to introduce it. You didn't, so you wisely introduced it.
Well, and Zach and I were talking about that earlier. Like, we were both of a generation that wasn't alive at that time. But like, I remember, and I have a background in theology and history myself, so I was introduced to the council in my studies, and I was always fascinated by it because the shift toward a church that was more open, toward dialogue, reconciliation, all these key words, and we'll get back to Signs of the Times, but that was really appealing to me as a young Catholic who had a lot of non-Catholic friends and wanted to, work in the church or be part of the church. But we don't have a memory. We don't have a living memory of that thing. And it seems now very kind of controversial, or at least there's debates about the council resurfacing, and we weren't a part of. So the fact that we have you here, and you were a young man at the time, right? I think you might have been. I don't know if you were in formation with the Jesuits at the time, but what do you remember? Like, what was that? Those 4 years.
Let me connect this with something else. The fact is that the book was born because of conversation with Christian Baroni,
Your co-author.
my co-author, who is around your age, and fairly soon we recognized that we both had a deep interest in the council, because I lived through it and he studied it. So we recognized that each of us had a partial experience and that the two experiences would complement each other. And interestingly enough, the Holy Father, as he explains in his preface, he's older than I am, so in one sense he lived through it, but he doesn't say that that's why he's so rooted in the council. Rather, it's because the council was so implemented in Latin America that he lived it by living his life in the Jesuits and in the church. So Christian and I have that complementary experience of the council. And I've checked with other people my age, and they say that's exactly how it was for them too. In fact, one theologian, great theologian, said to me, "Yeah, we didn't have to read the council because the people who wrote it were all our professors. We knew them all, but that means that we thought we knew the council, and that doesn't take into account what actually happened at the council, how the decrees were produced, and how hard and how well the Holy Spirit worked."
Sure. And, even talk about what actually happened. This phrase, signs of the times, was way more controversial than I had ever thought of or heard. And I guess, if you were there living through it, you would have, been familiar with the debates at the time. But why was that such a big sticking point?
I'm not sure that it was all that debated. I think it was more like a fact of life. I don't know if you noticed that we point out that the phrase is hardly used by the council. I think 5 times in all, something like that, in the whole council. You would think that all the fuss that we're making about it, that it would be on every second page.
That's right. It's like the signs of the times, and then the whole concept of the spirit of the council, which are kind of two, I don't want to say controversial, but they're points that people identify with the council. Even if maybe the people who are at the council fathers themselves weren't necessarily overthinking those things.
Yeah, the only expression which is even more odd, in the sense that it's obviously at the heart of the council, is the word synod, which surely comes from the council but was not even used once.
Right.
That's another one of those words that I need to translate into American.
Synod on synodality is a bit tough for us.
Yeah. One of the, this is...
Do you want me to give you a suggestion?
Sure. Yes, please.
The real meaning of synod is a verb. It's to synod. To synod. And to synod is the verb that corresponds to the church. How does the church? The church churches by synoding.
Which
the church synods.
It's simple and also opens so many other questions, which I think is the point of why we're all coming together this October and next. But when I was reading this book and considering this idea of the signs of the time, so being open to the modern world, it sort of clicked for me that there is this massive debate functionally about how the church should relate to the outside world, history, the marching of events, however you want to phrase it. Other stuff.
Real stuff.
And on one side, you have people that it's this view that, okay, the church has this doctrine, this revelation,
this treasure. Not to use heavy words. This treasure,
and it will use that to convert stuff, the outside world. And on the other hand...
and bring people on board.
Yes. And on the other way of looking at it is that the church continues to find treasure or God's grace or what have you in the world, in outside stuff, that will continue to enrich the church's understanding of itself. Do I have the basic terms of the debate correct?
Your first one was better than your second.
Okay, all right. What do I have wrong about the second one?
Well, you should have started the second one the same way you started with the first, namely the church has a treasure.
Yeah.
But the question is, and this is classically Pope Francis, do you treasure it by keeping it, or do you treasure it by sharing it?
Do you swim in the gospel, or do you spread it?
Well, that must be American.
That must be.
I don't understand that.
Try translating that in Italy. That might be tough. Yeah.
But once I kind of realized this is sort of the terms of the debate, I went and looked back at my entire life. It's like, okay, at times I have felt certainly that I had this treasure and and the outside world was bad and I needed to protect this treasure because that's what kept me safe. And I've kind of gone through this process of trying to figure out what the other half of that means of being open to it. But I see this playing out in the church all the time. It is not entirely a settled question, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Is that correct? I mean, is it settled at the Vatican what the answer to this question is?
No, I think when put so broadly and so inclusively, I think it's not something that can possibly be settled. But we could say that the emphasis in recent councils before Vatican II was certainly the first. The faith needed protection, beginning especially with the reformations of the, and that was true until Vatican I, inclusive, and that is not true of Vatican II. And here comes something which is also in the council, but is especially emphasized by Pope Francis, and this is something that people that we here in America don't appreciate so much as pretty central, and that is the identification between Christianity and Europe. We don't, here in America, we don't realize that we actually partake largely, though not exclusively, of a European form of Catholicism. And we project that on the whole world. We don't see why people don't just cool it and live with it. Because that's the way it is. And that's not the way it is. And in Europe, we have the experience, maybe more than here in America, that the de-Europeanization of our faith and our life as a church is going on in a certain sense, whether we like it or not. In other words, it's not something we're busy doing. It's something we're living. But it makes a huge difference also in your original characterization. I mean, are we protecting or saving or defending the treasure, or are we sharing it? And if you want, I think you were suggesting this, discovering what it is by sharing.
When you put it that way too, it makes me think that it might be harder for you to overcome this or think about it in the more inductive type of way if you come from a position of power or historical influence, if you have more, because your characterization of this being more typical of the Western Church strikes me in that regard.
Or of
right?
decline, right? Because you're seeing like it's being watered down and people are going to mass less or what have you. Like it's slipping away, so I have to hold on to it.
And we see like resistance to, the types of church that Francis is trying to build, saying, we need to be a field hospital. I pulled up quickly on my computer his famous line from Evangelii Gaudium, which is his first major teaching document on the joy of the gospel, about the missionary impulse of the church. I prefer a church which is bruised, hurting, and dirty because it has been out on the streets, rather than a church which is unhealthy from being confined and clinging to its own security. I mean, so if you're a person who has come from a place where the church has typically had a lot of influence or had a lot of power, had a lot of security, in his words, clinging strikes me as an appropriate word for what I'm seeing. And that's really difficult to change. So this type of conversion, I mean, I'm curious about what your insights are and how you try to bring them out in the book. Like, how do we try to foster that conversion and engage in dialogue that will...
No, I don't think we foster it. I think, at least, again, quoting Francis, it's the poor who will save you from what you just said.
Well, and we get to the poor because we're going out, right? It's sort of like if you are more walled in, you aren't actually able to go to the peripheries.
Well, except that's what's so interesting about the synod process, because by inviting everyone to share, I think many parts of the church discovered that the poor are with us inside, but again, marginalized, excluded, not listened to, without voice, frustrated, and so on. So the synod is interesting in the sense that by inviting everyone to share, it cuts across some of the divisions that you articulated earlier.
One concrete example I wanted to bring in is maybe looking at climate change and Laudato Si, and just trying to apply this characterization to that issue. Because, if in the first one where, maybe we have the treasure and we're protecting it, it's, well, what does the church need to say about climate change? We can point to Genesis. We have this doctrine. What is there to know? And the other one, being more inductive and looking out into the world, you can listen to scientists, you can get other perspectives, and then bring that into dialogue with this treasure that you have. Is that how we get to we have a papal encyclical on climate change? Because that was very controversial, particularly here in America. When that happened, people said, "What does the Pope have to say about this?"
Well, that's true. I think if your point of departure is that the issue isn't real, or even if you would concede that it is real enough, but it's none of the Church's business, then maybe it's pretty hard to get into Laudato Si. Although Pope Francis doesn't. He never says, believe this or you're finished. In fact, if you ask which chapter spells out what we're supposed to do about environmental deterioration and poverty, because it's
all connected.
Both cries, the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth. The how to do chapter is all about dialogue. Dialogue. And I think very few of us would have thought, well, we're going to solve climate change or poverty by dialogue. But by the time we reach Fratelli Tutti, you see, yes, that's the only way.
Isn't that interesting? You've spent the vast majority of your ministry involved in work for social justice and applying the Church's Catholic social teachings. And, here we are now with Pope Francis for 10 years. We have, a good sample size of how he sees the future of the mission of the Church in the world, the application of what we believe to the world out there. And it starts with dialogue, which is it's not like an action item. Like when I'm young and idealistic about changing the world, I'm thinking about the march that I'm going to go on, or I'm thinking about the petition that I'm going to sign. But he starts with, and you just mentioned, dialogue. Why is that disposition of dialogue so important? And what does that do as a foundation or a cornerstone of the Church's social action?
Well, it overcomes the some of the polarities or dichotomies that were involved in your two examples of going on a march or signing a petition. You don't go on a march wondering about whether your position is right or not, or if somebody else might have something to tell you about it, and you don't sign a petition with that in mind either. You're convinced, or you might not be totally convinced, but your friends are convinced. Anyway, this is your position, end of story. And what the success would be if whoever's on the other side of the march or the petition would capitulate.
Right.
Yeah. That's all fine, except experience shows it doesn't work. It's a great theory, but it doesn't work. It's basically the theory that you can win conflicts and actually gain ground by it. And what Pope Francis and St. Francis teach is that conflict is self-destructive.
Although if you're coming from a place of oppression, and you need to step up, for yourself, on behalf of yourself and others, and you're coming from a position of voicelessness and powerlessness, sometimes that can feel like the only thing to do,
Well, I would say you do need to figure out how to resist. I'm not sure you need to figure out how to overcome and win.
So how does Pope Francis define dialogue, or how would he explain dialogue in this context?
I think he would use 3 words. Listen. You got it.
I know where this is going. I'm listening.
The third one.
He hasn't used this yet, but I'm sure he will someday. Listen until it hurts, and then listen some more. And just look back on your experience. I mean, if you feel that you have actually experienced what it means to bring the good news, if you've experienced the work of the Spirit, I suspect that you will say, yes, it's because I listened until it hurt. And once it stopped hurting, it's because I realized that I only have a fraction of the picture.
Some people, that terrifies a lot of people.
Me too. I don't enjoy it either.
But from a perspective, bring it back to climate change. It's like, okay, if the Church can listen to climate scientists and have that inform its teaching, that also means it could listen to, experts or competent authorities in matters of human sexuality or technology or artificial intelligence. And then you're admitting in some form or other that the church doesn't have all the answers or a monopoly on.
That's right.
truth.
But one could reformulate your claim a bit more helpfully.
Yes.
It's not the church's vocation to listen to climate scientists. It's the church's vocation to listen to people who are suffering because of extreme weather events. It's not the same thing. The scientists have a role to play in our Christian reading of the signs of the times and in our effort to accompany the poor. That's our vocation. The climate scientists are mostly employed in talking to each other and to the UN. God bless them all. I don't think it's going to help much.
So the fundamental...
But they have a very important contribution to make when people are ready to listen and when they are ready to roll up their sleeves and do something about it and say, well, let's do something about it. Well, then, first in grasping the problem and then in finding solutions, we'd be fools not to avail ourselves of the best possible science, the best possible technology, the best possible finance, the best possible politics, all those things. But those are not our primary business.
The business is starting with listening to the poor.
It starts, it continues, and it finishes with listening to the poor.
I was thinking the other sort of big concept, I was thinking dialogue, this other big concept that comes to my mind is evangelization. Like in all of these conversations that we're having now, and you mentioned the Synod a few times, which is surfacing them more. So we're all, the Catholics around the world are now talking to each other in this extraordinarily open way. And so all these issues are coming to the fore. But at the core of your book, of the things that we're talking about, is really how do we understand the church's mission? Like you've talked about it as listening to the poor. But this concept of evangelization, which is the...
Yeah, but I think this is the transition that our book tries to document also. You just said how to understand the mission. But the mission is not primarily something to understand, And I think that we might have got ourselves into a sort of an intellectual knot over the council for the first 50 years. And Francis doesn't disagree with all of that. He just says, let's get on with something else. Let's get on with implementing it.
Now, I'm wondering, for Sebastian and I were talking, this feels like a sort of intense time in the church, interesting time in the church, crazy time in the church, however you want to put it. But we were mentioning earlier, we didn't live through the council. We don't have necessarily that historical perspective. Is it as interesting as it seems right now?
Yeah, but you're asking somebody who's in his more than his mid-70s about something that he lived through when he was 17 and 18. So I'm not sure I can make that comparison. I would say that maybe I put it a bit differently, that there is no time when our salvation isn't at stake. There is no time when the church can say, well, we've evangelized and now we don't need to. There is no time when sin takes a holiday and we don't need forgiveness and reconciliation. So maybe again the question is not answerable, or it doesn't matter. What does it matter? What does it matter?
It's probably ego that wants the answer to that question.
You've seen a lot of things, so give us some advice. Give us some spiritual advice.
That's very dangerous. Especially
from a cardinal, from a Jesuit cardinal.
Especially if you don't ask.
But I'm mostly not on the show, a host of the Jesuitical podcast. I'm usually in the background, but I'm producing it with Zac and Ashley every week. And I know that our audience, appreciates going to a deeper spiritual level of these conversations. So, if you try to tie a spiritual bow around what you're doing with this book and how we're trying to, focus on living the church's mission as opposed to understanding it or talking about it, what's your advice?
Well, I would say maybe to take the title seriously. Siblings All, Sign of the Times. Siblings All, which is a translation of Fratelli Tutti, is interesting because in Italian there's an abstraction for this. It's called fraternità, and it's still practically totally acceptable to say fraternita, and you mean men and women, brothers and sisters. But I don't think that's true in English anymore. So calling the book Fraternity would have seemed like it's for frats only, you know?
Yeah, frat houses and such.
That's right. So siblings all is already, but it's interesting because in Italian it's an abstraction, the idea of, whereas in English it's more concrete. Siblings is not an abstraction, it's a name, and it's concrete. And then it says sign of the times. Why is it a sign of the times? What does sign of the times mean? Sign of the times means a human reality that the Holy Spirit illuminates for us so that we recognize Christ's desire to be incarnate there. That's what a sign of the times is. It's not a trend. It's not a fashion. It's not the cutting edge. It's not where you should invest if you want to make a lot of money.
It's not the latest headline of the week like we treated on this show.
It's not either
or
this
the hottest
week
take
or last week's or this week's headline. No, it's a spiritual, evangelical, human place. And I think that everybody listening to this show, and many others who already know they don't want to listen to this show, are looking for that place. They want to meet Christ. Maybe more than anything else. But if sign of the times isn't a possibility for them, then I think he's harder to meet. Mm-hmm. And he regrets that. But he's very patient.
Cardinal Czerny, you've been very generous with your time and coming on the show, and so thank you so much for joining us and also for all the work you're doing for the Church. Before we let you go, we have one final question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, Catholic or not, fictional or real, who would it be and why?
Pope Francis, because he's implementing Vatican II.
That is your boss, so it feels a little...
No, he's not my boss.
No.
I would never call him
He's
my
not
boss.
twisting your arm a little bit?
So Pope Francis.
Yeah.
All right.
You wouldn't be the first on the podcast. Huh?
No,
A lot of people.
he is
But
a very common answer.
We're in good company then.
Yeah.
Amen. So once again, the book is Siblings All, Sign of the Times, The Social Teaching of Pope Francis. It is out from Orbis Books, and we will link to that in the show notes. Cardinal Czerny, thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. God bless you all.
Thanks for watching. Before you go, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and also check out Jesuitical wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like the show, the best way to support our work is with a digital subscription to America Magazine. You can do that at americamagazine.org/subscribe.